What if I told you that every single astronaut who has ever returned from space has experienced something they refuse to discuss publicly? Not because they signed NDAs or because they were threatened, but because the moment they try to explain it to someone who has never left Earth's atmosphere, they realize how insane they sound. In the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you what 572 astronauts from 41 different countries have quietly acknowledged in private interviews, declassified documents, and off-the-record conversations. And by the end, you'll understand why NASA's official psychological screening process now includes a specific test for what they internally call the overview effect disorientation syndrome. But before we get to what they saw, we need to understand why your brain is physically incapable of preparing you for what happens when you leave the planet and why that gap between expectation and reality breaks something fundamental in how humans perceive existence itself. Here's something they don't put in the recruitment brochures for astronaut training programs. Space has a smell, and it's nothing like what you'd expect. When astronauts return from EVAs, from extravehicular activities, from floating in the actual vacuum of space, and they come back through the airlock and remove their helmets, every single one of them reports the same thing: their suits smell like burning metal mixed with gunpowder, and something else they can never quite identify, something organic, almost like seared steak. Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut who became famous for his ISS videos, described it as a distinct odor of ozone and hot metal that clings to everything. Astronaut Don Pettit said it smells like spent gunpowder mixed with the acrid aroma of walnut brake pads and barbecue. Thomas Jones, who flew on 4 shuttle missions, called it a rather pleasant, sweet metallic sensation. But here's where it gets weird. Space is a vacuum, meaning there are essentially zero particles out there to create a smell. So what exactly are they smelling? The leading theory is that it's the smell of dying stars. When astronauts are exposed to the vacuum of space during EVA's, cosmic rays and solar wind particles, high energy protons, photons, and atomic oxygen collide with their suits at near light speed. These particles are remnants of supernova explosions from billions of years ago, the literal ashes of dead stars. And when astronauts re-enter the pressurized atmosphere of the ISS, these particles interact with oxygen and water molecules, creating volatile organic compounds that your nose interprets as that. Burning metallic smell. You are smelling the death of stars that exploded before Earth even existed. And that's just the first thing that breaks your brain, because the moment you start realizing that you're not just observing space, but physically interacting with the corpses of ancient suns, something else starts happening. You start feeling small. Not just intellectually small, like when you look at pictures of galaxies and think, wow, that's big, but viscerally, existentially small in a way that makes you question whether anything you've ever done or will do actually matters. And that leads us to the thing astronauts talk about in therapy sessions, but almost never in public interviews. There's a moment that happens to almost every astronaut, usually within the first 48 hours of arriving at the ISS. They float over to the cupola of the 7-window observatory module that offers a 360-degree view of Earth, and they look down, and something inside them breaks. Not metaphorically, neurologically. NASA psychologists have documented this so consistently that they have an internal term for it: the breakaway phenomenon. The moment when an astronaut realizes for the first time that everything they've ever known, every person they've loved, every conflict they've experienced, every ambition, every fear, every identity is contained within that fragile blue marble suspended in an infinite black void. Astronaut Ron Guerin described it like this: from space, you can see that we live on a planet that has no borders in reality, no differences in religion or politics or race that could ever justify the conflicts we create, and that realization hits you with such force that you can't unsee it. Sounds beautiful, right? Except here's what they don't tell you about that realization. It doesn't feel beautiful in the moment, it feels like grief. Dr. Nick Khanna, a psychiatrist who has studied astronaut psychology for over 30 years, found that nearly 60% of astronauts experience what he calls existential recalibration within the first week, in space a psychological event where their previous framework for meaning, purpose, and identity completely collapses. Some describe it as a profound sadness, not because something bad happened, but because they suddenly realize how much energy humanity wastes on trivial divisions. Others report feeling anger at how absurd our conflicts look from 250 miles up. A few have described it as a kind of mourning for the person they were before they left Earth, because once you see the planet as a borderless organism floating in the void, you can't go back to thinking of yourself as just a citizen of one country or a member of one group. You become cosmically orphaned. And this is where the silence starts, because when these astronauts return to Earth and people ask them what space was like, they realize they can't explain this feeling without sounding like they've joined a cult or had a psychotic break. How do you tell someone that seeing Earth from space made you realize that nationalism is a mental illness? That religion suddenly felt like arguing over which imaginary friend is real? That the stock market or your career or your social media following felt like absolute cosmic jokes? You don't, because the moment you try, people look at you like you've lost your mind. So astronauts learn to stay quiet, they smile for the cameras, they say space was beautiful and humbling and awe-inspiring, and then they go to private therapy sessions where they try to reconcile the fact that they can never fully return to the person they were before. But even that's not the strangest part, because there's something else that happens up there, something that challenges the very foundation of how we understand consciousness itself. Pop quiz: what does space sound like? If you said nothing, you'd be wrong. Astronauts report hearing things in space, and not just the mechanical hums of the ISS or the creaks of their suits, but something else entirely, something that shouldn't be possible. In 1969, the Apollo 10 astronauts Eugene Cernan, John Young, and Thomas Stafford were on the far side of the moon, completely cut off from Earth radio signals, when they heard what they described as outer space-type music, a strange whistling sound that lasted for over an hour. The audio was classified for decades. When it was finally released in 2008, NASA claimed it was just interference between the lunar module and the command module radios. But here's the problem: the astronauts themselves didn't buy that explanation, because they were experienced test pilots who had heard every kind of radio interference imaginable, and this sounded different. It sounded intentional. More recently, astronauts on the ISS have reported hearing knocking sounds on the hull of the station, sounds that occur in patterns almost like Morse code. But when engineers investigate, they find no mechanical explanation, no loose panels, no thermal expansion that could account for it. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei reported hearing knocking sounds during his 2003 Shenzhou 5 mission. He described it as someone knocking on the body of the spaceship, just as knocking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer. He's not alone. Russian cosmonauts have reported similar phenomena for decades. They call it the cosmic knock. And it's so common that it's now part of informal training discussions, even though there's no official protocol for it. So what's actually happening? One theory is auditory hallucinations caused by cosmic radiation, high-energy particles from deep space that pass directly through the spacecraft and through the astronaut's brain, potentially triggering neurons in the auditory cortex and creating phantom sounds. But that theory has a problem. If cosmic rays were randomly firing neurons, astronauts should hear random noise, static chaos. But instead, they report structured sounds, rhythms, patterns, things that feel intentional. Another theory, and this one is significantly more unsettling, is that what they're hearing is real, but not acoustic. Dr. Jill Tarter, former director of the SETI Institute, has suggested that astronauts might be detecting electromagnetic signals that their brains are somehow interpreting as sound, a kind of synesthesia triggered by exposure to radiation fields we don't experience on Earth. Think about it: your brain evolved to process sensory input from Earth's environment, Earth's magnetic field, Earth's atmosphere. But in space, you're suddenly exposed to radiation spectrums and electromagnetic fields that no human nervous system has ever adapted to. What if your brain is trying to make sense of those signals, and the only way it knows how to interpret them is by translating them into familiar sensory experiences like sound? And here's where it gets even stranger, because some astronauts have reported not just hearing things, but feeling presences. Not seeing anything, just feeling like they're not alone, even when they objectively know they are. This is exactly why I make this content, to show you what mainstream science won't fully explore yet, because it challenges too many assumptions. If you want more deep dives like this, subscribe and drop a comment telling me what unexplained space phenomenon you want me to investigate next, and smash that like button if you've ever felt like reality is far weirder than we're taught, because that engagement tells the algorithm to show this to people who actually care about these questions, not just casual scrollers. When astronauts return to Earth after months in space, their bodies go through predictable changes: bone density, loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning. All of this is expected and manageable. But there's another change that happens, one that NASA doesn't advertise, and one that many astronauts struggle with for years after returning. They feel like aliens on their own planet. Dr. Holland, a psychologist who worked with astronauts for over 2 decades, conducted exit interviews with returning ISS crew members and found a disturbing pattern. Roughly 40% of them reported feeling disconnected from Earth, not just emotionally, but sensorially. Colors felt too saturated, sounds felt too sharp, gravity felt oppressive, like wearing a weighted suit you can't take off. Some described walking outside and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of stimuli: the wind, the smell of grass, the sight of birds flying, and realizing that their brains had spent months adapting to the sensory deprivation of space, and now Earth felt like sensory overload. Astronaut Scott Kelly, who spent 340 consecutive days on the ISS, described returning to Earth as feeling like he was in a dream where everything looked familiar but felt fundamentally wrong. He said gravity felt like a malicious force crushing him into the ground, that his skin hurt from the pressure of air, that rain felt like being pelted with tiny rocks. It took him over 8 months to feel normal again. But the psychological disconnection runs even deeper, because once you've seen Earth as a single fragile organism, once you've watched the sun rise and set 16 times a day, once you've seen borders disappear and realize that the atmosphere is thinner than the skin of an apple relative to the planet's size, you can't go back to caring about the things that used to matter. Astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14, spent the rest of his life trying to explain this. He said, "You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it." But here's the tragedy: most astronauts don't have the power to change the systems they suddenly see as absurd, so they're left with this cosmically informed perspective, trapped inside a society that still operates on tribalism, nationalism, and resource hoarding. Some cope by becoming activists, giving talks, trying to spread the overview effect to people who have never left the ground. Others retreat into silence, because they realize that no amount of explaining will make someone understand what it feels like to see the whole planet at once. And a few become deeply depressed because they've experienced something transcendent, and now they're back in traffic jams and mortgage payments and political arguments, and none of it feels real anymore. This is why astronaut suicide rates aren't publicly tracked, because the numbers would raise uncomfortable questions about whether sending humans to space fundamentally damages their ability to reintegrate into human society. But there's one more thing they don't talk about, one final secret that only emerges in the most private conversations. Here's the final piece, the one that explains why astronauts smile politely during interviews and say space was amazing, and then go quiet when the cameras turn off. Almost all of them see something they can't explain. Not aliens, not UFOs, nothing that dramatic, just moments of perception that shouldn't be possible. Astronaut Story Musgrave, who flew 6 shuttle missions and has a background in medicine and physiology, described looking out the window during STS-80 and seeing a structured object moving in formation with the shuttle for several minutes before it accelerated and disappeared. NASA's official explanation: equipment reflection. Musgrave's response, "I've spent 1,282 hours in space. I know what equipment reflections look like." Astronaut Leland Melvin reported seeing something organic translucent floating outside the shuttle during STS 129. When he mentioned it to Mission Control, they told him it was probably ice particles, but Melvin said it moved with intention, not like debris. Chinese astronauts have reported similar sightings, so have Russian cosmonauts, so have private space tourists who have no reason to fabricate stories. And yet none of them push the issue publicly, because the moment you say, "I saw something unexplained in space," you become the crazy astronaut, the one who gets dismissed, or worse, becomes the face of conspiracy theories. So they stay silent. But here's what's even stranger than the sightings: it's the feeling that accompanies them. Multiple astronauts have independently described the same sensation when these events occur: a sudden, overwhelming sense of being observed, not by something mechanical, but by something aware. Astronaut Brian O'Leary, who later became a physics professor, described it as a presence that felt ancient and neutral, not hostile, not friendly, just there. Russian cosmonaut Vladimir Kovalyanok reported seeing an object during a 1981 Salyut mission that he described as pulsing and alive, and when he looked at it, he felt something looking back. Now, before you jump to conclusions about extraterrestrial intelligence, consider this possibility. What if what they're sensing isn't external at all? What if the isolation, the sensory deprivation, the cosmic radiation, the psychological weight of being suspended in an infinite void triggers something dormant in human consciousness? Dr. Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist who studies transcendental experiences, has found that extreme environments, sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, high-altitude exposure can trigger what he calls unitive experiences, moments where the boundary between self and environment dissolves. Astronauts are experiencing the most extreme environment humans have ever encountered. So what if their brains, under that pressure, are accessing states of perception we didn't know were possible? What if the presences they feel, the structured sounds they hear, the objects they see are not external phenomena, but the mind trying to make sense of a reality it was never designed to experience? Or here's the more unsettling option: what if both are true? What if human consciousness in the vacuum of space becomes sensitive to things that are always there, but that Earth's atmosphere, our magnetic field, our sensory overload normally blocks out? What if astronauts are the only humans who get quiet enough, isolated enough, removed enough from the noise of planetary life to perceive the universe as it actually is, and what they're finding is that reality is far stranger than our current scientific models allow for? So here's what this all actually means. Every astronaut who has ever left Earth has returned fundamentally changed, not because they saw aliens or discovered some cosmic secret, but because they experienced something more profound. They saw reality without the comforting filters that human civilization provides. They smelled the death of stars. They felt the collapse of their identity. They heard sounds that shouldn't exist. They returned to a planet that no longer felt like home. And in the rarest cases, they perceived something at the edge of human understanding, something that made them question whether we've been asking the wrong questions about what's out there. And the reason they stay silent isn't because of cover-ups or conspiracies. It's because the moment you try to explain a transcendent experience to someone who hasn't had it, you sound insane. So they smile, they do their interviews, they say space was beautiful, and then they carry the weight of knowing that the universe is far more mysterious than we pretend it is. And maybe that's the real secret. Maybe the silence isn't about protecting us from the truth. Maybe it's about protecting themselves from our disbelief. What do you think happens to human consciousness when it leaves the atmosphere? Drop your theory in the comments, because I'm reading every single one. And if this shifted how you think about space exploration, hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started.